My name is Chang Liu, and I'm the cluster manager at Blockchain VC. And today we are very pleased to have Allan Matheson, the founder of Golden Pear Capital, joining us. And he's going to talk about blockchain as a business force. And Allan is the founder of Golden Pear Capital, which is a liquid token crypto hedge fund that provides sophisticated investors with a portfolio of fundamentally sound positions and utilizes decentralized finance to generate and compound yields. Allan is a successful tech entrepreneur who has built and sold 4 companies, primarily in compliance technology. He's a mentor in the Web3 cohort of Creative Destruction Labs, sits on the boards of Oliver Benefits Administration Software, and he's also a leader in Europe in legal publishing and legal tech. So without further ado, let's welcome Allan and look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much. So before I get started, maybe I'd love to learn a little bit more about who I'm talking to. I know some of you guys, but I'd love to know a little bit more about, sort of your experience with blockchain, your interest in blockchain. We approach it from a lot of different angles. And from my own perspective, as someone running a hedge fund, I'm very much focused on the business applications, like revenue generation and the capability to, generate returns. But of course, that's not necessarily, where we all approach the matter. So I'd love to know from you guys, how many of you here are technologists? No? What about finance people? Finance, quite a few in finance, okay. And do you have experience with decentralized finance?
Yeah, so kind of revenue generation.
Great. And yourself, you're working on high frequency trading, DeFi. That's fantastic. How about some others in the room? What's your sort of interest and or connection with blockchain? Transparency, right? So that's a fantastic sort of jumping off point, is that, I think there are lots of different use cases for blockchain, and a lot of benefits that it can bring. Part of the issue, I think, with where blockchain currently is at is that we're still building the infrastructure. And that's problematic when you start talking about use cases, because some of the infrastructure doesn't quite exist. And we're going to touch on both the infrastructure side and what's being built throughout the presentation. So first, what happened to my presentation? One second. Sorry, guys. It was working properly a moment ago. I think the sizing changed of the. You know what? When all else fails, unplug it, plug it back in again. Just one moment. Sorry, guys. Oh, well, there we go. That worked.
Fail-safe technique. Just unplug it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So just again, a bit of background on myself. I actually went to UBC. I went to international relations. I noticed looking at the legend over there that actually Arts One is in this building. I did Arts One when I was here. Shows how long ago it was that Arts One had a house in the middle of the campus. It was a very bizarre kind of a beautiful place where these really smart, capable people would sit around and talk about philosophy and economics and all the rest of it. And now we have this beautiful building housing precisely that function, but it maybe is a bit of an indication as to when I went to UBC. And then I went and I when I graduated from UBC, I went to China. I put a backpack on. And in 1998, I went to China. I studied at Tsinghua University, learned Mandarin. And China was, a little rough around the edges back then, but I just loved it. It was a fantastic opportunity. And it was really fun to want to be and live on this frontier where, you could see the Chinese economy, growing into the world economy and the effects that that had not only on China, but globally. And to take a front seat to that was fantastic. I moved down to Hong Kong in 2000 and lived there for 16 years. Built a few companies and sold them primarily in the compliance technology space post 2008 financial crisis, seeing that that would be another frontier. We would see that, that because of what happened in the financial crisis, compliance was going to be an area where there would be a lot of spend, and built SaaS businesses in that space. And so I've built my career primarily identifying and going and living and building on frontiers. And never have I seen a frontier that I find more compelling than blockchain technology. And I think that when the internet was constructed, perhaps they left a piece out. The internet is fantastic at distributing data and transferring data, but it doesn't have its own settlement layer. And crypto, as I refer to it, because I see crypto as the terminology for the culture, crypto brings that technology to bear, where if you go and you buy something on Amazon, you're just using, Visa and MasterCard's rails. Those are not new rails. Those are not native rails to the internet. And Web3 crypto brings that settlement layer directly to the internet. And that's what I find really exciting. So what are we going to talk about today? Why are we here? I was speaking to Chang, and he was mentioning that, there are lots of technologists, academics working on these kinds of blockchain problems and solutions, but that sometimes the tokenomics side, the driving value, how these things can be significantly disruptive businesses, maybe is something where I could shed some light. So I would encourage you, please, both on the Zoom and in person, if you have questions or you want to stop and talk about something, let's do it. Let's have a discussion. I'm delighted to make it a very interactive session. But really, I want to talk about a few key takeaways that I hope that I can impress upon you. One is precisely as I mentioned just now. Web 2 was about the transfer of data. Web 3, where we're moving towards, is about adds the transfer of value. And when you can transfer value, when huge systems can reach consensus that value used to be here and now it's there, that is a tremendously powerful concept. And combined with smart contracts, that allows us this capability to be able to design systems that are internet native, that not only benefit from the transfer of data, but also this capability to transfer value. And when we have that value transfer, you need some form of game theory involved. And that's an important part because when you have trustless systems, as the majority of these systems are, if you don't have the right incentive model in place, then they won't work. You have to have incentives and penalties aligned, or these systems will self-destruct, essentially. And last but not least, because of those factors, you're going to see that large entrenched businesses are going to be extremely disruptive. And so we'll take a little bit of a look at some of those: decentralized finance, decentralized physical infrastructure, and social. First, let's talk a little bit about tokenization. Game theory, as I mentioned before, when you have permissionless systems, trustless systems where anyone can interact with them and there is value, you have to employ proper game theory. And that game theory applies to all the different actors. So it could be the validators, miners. For instance, in the Ethereum proof of stake system, you stake 32 ETH. If you go there and you decide I'm running a validator and I get to mine a block, and all of a sudden I'm going to say, no, that didn't really happen. Instead, I'm going to, abscond with some value. Then that 32 ETH is up for slashing. We have to have some type of both penalties and rewards. So the reward in the same kind of system is the system remains up. You are rewarded for that. You get incentivized to make sure that the system is robust. So you have this reward and penalty, which helps encourage honesty and discourage any kind of bad actors. And that leads to not only, sort of bad actors, but it also leads to to discouraging bad actors. It also leads to security and Sybil resistance. So when blockchains, for instance, are too inexpensive, you have this like Sybil DDoS, denial of service problem, which is actually happening to Solana right now, for instance, where like at the moment, 75% of transactions on Solana are failing because the volume is just so heavy and it's so inexpensive that these kinds of problems come up. So we have now actually the folks at Solana are struggling with this, and they're struggling with the same kinds of problems that, for instance, Ethereum dealt with 7-8 years ago, and looking at how they can change their gas markets in order to make sure that they're avoiding these kinds of problems. Governance is another area where game theory comes into play. A lot of protocols launch governance tokens. These governance tokens, of course, there's incentives to participate in votes sometimes. But the governance systems designed are also, let's call it developing. I like to kind of make an analogy of some of these decentralized systems that are tokenized with homeowners associations. Have any of you ever been to like a homeowner association meeting where it's a council, and the idea that like the 80-year-old grandmother who's owned her place for 50 years and the 25-year-old tech bro, they're not going to get on the same page with regards to like making renovations that cost a lot of money to the lobby. And it's the same thing in some of these governance DAOs. Like you have massive battles, you have entrenched interests, and some of them work really well through this. Some of them, it adds that transparency, it adds that kind of capability for people to have discussions about the issues at hand. On the other hand, you have others that are like almost completely dysfunctional. But it's also a way that you can employ game theory to ensure that you get value out of these tokenomic models. And of course, in the smart contract deployment, as these environments are tokenized, it has to be done properly, or it can really lead to downward spirals. The one thing that I would sort of raise as a question, I'm not sure I necessarily have the answer, is whether in permissioned blockchains, you actually require the same kind of game theory. I would argue yes. I would argue that absolutely, even though if you're optimizing for transparency, and you have a permission set of validators, for instance, I would argue that yes, actually, you still do need some type of game theory in order to make sure that people are motivated to operate properly, fairly, for security, for maintenance of the systems. But again, I'm not sure. I think if those things are not true, then the question must be asked, like, why not just use a database? And because, of course, the data that usually exists in those systems, data and potentially value is important and valuable, and so it probably also needs to be optimized. When we talk about tokenomic models, I think we're all familiar with the general kind of format for traditional corporate ecosystems, shareholders at the top, if you will, directors, management, and then companies, employees, and typically customers generate revenue directly. Companies, employees tend to have the lowest kind of say in an organization, and then management, directors, and of course shareholders end up collecting dividends. And this is sort of looks quite a bit more confusing representation of what I feel a lot of tokenomic models can loosely be modeled after. So at the top, you have developers. Developers have an idea. They want to build a system. Let's say it's a lending, borrowing ecosystem. They design the contracts and they launch permissionless, decentralized smart contracts. That's your protocol. That's launched onto a blockchain, and that collects users. Users find that it has value. I have, for instance, Ether, and I want to borrow US dollars against my Ether, maybe because I want to buy more Ether, or maybe because I want to buy, house. Regardless, that those contracts derive value and they generate revenue. The developers then typically will develop tokens. And they'll tokenize this environment to say the token provides a decentralized autonomous organization with governance rights. And rather than keeping, I do a lot of speeches and talks with big business leaders. And the one thing they can never grapple with, and the one thing they have a really hard time kind of understanding is that when you build a company, you can borrow cash, but once you give equity away, it never comes back. It's gone. So you always want to, keep as much equity as you possibly can, right? If you believe your company is valuable, your equity is the most valuable thing that you have. And so a lot of traditional people in business say never ever give your equity away. These developers typically are giving away at least 70%, sometimes more, to users, typically users, and generally the community. And that goes into this decentralized autonomous organization. Users are incentivized to use the protocol and provided with tokens for doing that. And thereby, they're creating an alignment between the users, typically, and the people who want to exercise governance rights over these smart contracts. And so I have a friend, he launched a protocol. He kept only 5% of tokens for himself and the founders, and 95% of the, if you would call it, it's not, but similar to equity, basically the rights to govern, meaning if I have the rights to govern and that those permissionless contracts are earning revenue, I can govern it to say, give me the revenue. They were keeping only 5% of that and using 95% to incentivize activity and align users with their objectives. So that's a really important part of the ecosystem and of how tokenization works. And through that, you can design really interesting, very interesting different kinds of capabilities to essentially attack traditional businesses, which is what we're going to talk about. Before that, I can field questions that are coming up. I can sense that there's a counterpoint. Does anyone know what that is? Yeah, let's go. No, actually, you got it. That's with. It's called dog with hat, WIF. You got to admit, it's a cute dog. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. It's a cute dog. Look, a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people and tell them about, how wonderful I think blockchain technology is and how disruptive it's going to be and how interesting it is. And people always point to this and they're like, dog with hat is a meme coin. Anyone in this room could spin up a meme coin. It would take you like 5 minutes. It would take Ramesh about a minute and a half, but it doesn't matter. We don't need it. It's not a competition. But anyone in this room could start a meme coin. Any guesses as to how much dog with hat is worth at the moment in terms of, its price times the total amount of dog with hat tokens that are outstanding? 1 or 200 million, 50 million? Multiple. It's worth 3.5 billion US dollars. It's insane, right? I mean, you could just create such a thing. Although, it's a cute dog. It's a cute dog. It's a nice hat. I guess the counter to that really, though, is this too is disrupting an industry. On the top left, you have gambling revenue. The pink is Macau. The blue is Vegas. That's annualized. The blue line, other than COVID, is relatively straight up. The pink line, Macau was destroyed in COVID. It really got hurt very badly, as not many people were able to travel there. But it's coming back. On the top right, you have MGM stock value. And so you have this like up and to the right. And you think about both of those sort of elements. And I would argue that actually meme coins are this generation, like a lot of young people in this room. It's your generation's kind of way of gambling. So it is a business use case. And some, I think, would argue it's even more of a business use case, given that memes, which is kind of playing to the attention economy, plus this idea of financial nihilism. Do people understand what financial nihilism, this movement of financial nihilism? Yeah, and it's predicated on the idea that like young people will have a very difficult time affording, say, a home. And so to like YOLO everything on dog with hat makes no sense. But that's the nihilistic part. It makes no sense, but maybe it goes to 3.5 billion. And a lot of people did make a lot of money. So you know what? I don't need to invest in like some, in the queues or in like some mutual fund where that gets me 7% a year. That's not going to do it for me. Let's gamble it. And that's this idea of like financial nihilism. I think you take memes, financial nihilism, and you have like a better form of gambling for this generation. Okay, crypto and oligopolies. A lot of oligopolies are famously very difficult to attack. And the one thing that people often point towards is, no, like if you're innovative enough, you can do it. Just look at Tesla. Actually, I think Tesla is the exact counter argument, because Tesla, although a very innovative company, and they did totally transform the car industry. At the time Tesla started, you would have to be absolutely insane to start a car company, a new car company. It was not an attractive industry. It was actually like all of them were really in bad positions. So what did it? Actually, billions and billions and billions of dollars of subsidies went into and continues to go into Tesla. I'm not taking away like from Elon and Tesla and the folks who've really transformed things. I'm just saying, I think that the subsidy element gave them probably tens of billions of dollars. If you take carbon credits alone, they're gifted $1.5 to $1.8 billion in essentially revenue per year. You can see in the bottom right. 2023 was $1.79 billion. Do you know where it came from? Other car makers. Other car makers have to buy their carbon credits. So in fact, it's like a double whammy. You get it going from both sides. So I think like the amount of capital to go into some of these like established industries is enormous. It's incredible. But there is another way. I'll talk a little bit about helium. Anyone here familiar with helium? So helium is a protocol. It is designed to essentially vampire attack physical infrastructure in the form of Internet of Things infrastructure, Wi-Fi, data provision, and mobile. Most of these industries that are being disrupted and going to be disrupted, because they're oligopolies as well, are also some of the most vilified. Like, who here likes their telecom carrier? I mean, we are in Canada, so I think it's almost illegal to like your carrier. But anyway, I don't think that's very different no matter where you live. Helium at the moment, their business model is thusly. You pay $250 and you can get a hotspot. It's a piece of infrastructure. You plug it basically into your router, and it broadcasts the capability to be used for, there's different kinds. There's IoT, but in this case, we'll talk about mobile. So it broadcasts basically like a 5G, you can connect to it for 5G mobile hotspot. It's essentially like a cell tower, like a little cell tower. There's currently close to 1 million hotspots out there. And in the United States, they now launched, in partnership with T-Mobile, $20 a month plan to connect through Helium. When you have your hotspot, you earn tokens. They pay you in tokens. And so they pay this $20 a month. The subscribers pay $20 a month. And the coverage, actually, you can see the map in the lower left, is relatively interesting. There's some more nuance to the different tokenomics, excuse me, behind the entire model. Helium at the moment is worth $1.35 billion by its value. And they launched in the United States. They also just recently launched a partnership in January with Telefonica in Mexico. So think about that. Helium was not a well-funded entity. They vampire attacked their way to be one of the first people who bought one of these nodes. You know, it's a bit of a bet, but those people also earned a lot of tokens. And so as it grows, this alignment between people who are providing these like cell tower services, beside, you know, probably those are the same people who are subscribing for the plans, you're creating a community around this idea of like, we're vampire attacking one of the most hated industries in the world. It's quite an interesting model, and it looks like they're having some success with it. Okay, for the record, none of these businesses am I necessarily endorsing and or saying, you know, this is the future, but they are illustrative examples. Let's talk about decentralized finance. According to the World Bank, remittances, so payments, cross-border payments, just the ones going to low and middle income countries, increased by about 3.8% in 2023 to about $670 billion at an average cost of 6%. That means $40 billion of the transfers went into, you know, banks, companies like Western Union. I did a quick look on for a price estimate to send $150 to the Philippines. You have fees, which are, I have to admit, I can't read it, $5 to like $12 on $150. That's not small. That's a pretty big take rate. On the other hand, and by the way, that's not the only way they earn their fees. They also will offer like FX capabilities. Of course, they take a cut on the FX. Sometimes there are also fees for collecting the money. So there are a bunch of fees that are probably not even involved in that. But on average, the World Bank says 6%. On the other hand, I went to my wallet. I did a transfer of 150 USDC, which is essentially a tokenized US dollar. And on Arbitrum, that cost me $0.0068, 0.68 cents to do that same thing. Oh, and by the way, if I wanted to transfer not $150, but $150 million, the price is the same. So payments industry is becoming disrupted. And you can see that by crypto ownership. There are these studies around like how many people own crypto. A lot of times that's actually just using stablecoins. It is crypto, but they're using stablecoins. So if you look at the top countries in this study, I'm sorry, I have to change my own view. Nigeria, 47%, Turkey, 47%, Thailand, 40 something. You have to go all the way down here. Hong Kong, 19%. United States, 18%. Most of these are developing countries. Why? I think a lot of it is because they're actually using these rails for payments. I had the kind of pithy quote on the title slide that said, "Dude, pay me back for lunch." And in a lot of countries, if you're, just doing daily payments and you can do it on your mobile, you can do it. Bang, here you go. And it doesn't cost much. It costs very little and it's easy.
Maybe
And
keep
also
going the network.
you can retain your position. So at the moment, there's about $153 billion in stablecoins. That's very small percentage. That's only about 0.74% of the M2 money supply.
Yeah.
It's kind of like all cash and cash equivalents. And then you have, the next iteration, the thing that makes this even better is that we will be moving towards a better version of a dollar. What does that mean? It means that rather than having a dollar, which doesn't increase in value while I hold it, I could hold a tokenized treasury. So it's a treasury. Treasuries, you earn yield on treasuries. And thusly, if I hold a tokenized version of that, I would rather hold that than a plain US dollar, right? I'm earning yield while I am holding my cash. And so there's this kind of innovation as well. And this number just passed $1 billion of tokenized treasuries, which are now active in, on chain. They're earning about 5% annually. If you look at the yellow bit right here, this is interesting. That's a new entrant. That's BlackRock's tokenized money market fund, which just started about I don't even think it's a month old, and now has about $280 million circulating in this money market fund. BlackRock is not messing around. Okay, let's talk a little bit about social media. Anyone know what that's a reference to? Some of us a little on the Google, that's right. So Google used to famously have this motto, don't be evil. That was like their model. In March 2018, they stopped. They took that model out of their code of conduct. I don't know what kind of company you have to be to remove don't be evil, but anyway, I think the inference is like, you infer what you want, but I think the fact is, again, Web 2 is all about data, and the control of data is very important. And we're all victims of like social media, all of us. I think all of us believe we are not, and probably are equally as much victims as we think everybody else is. And the reason really is because we don't own our data. We've given it all away. So crypto actually has some interesting protocols that are looking at challenging this in a couple of different ways. Farcaster is probably the most interesting. And Farcaster, and on the next page, Lens is very similar. Essentially, they put together the plumbing to allow for all of the data to be, sort of flowing through open permissionless channels. And the way you consume it is through a client that sits on top. And if you want to switch clients, you can switch clients. You don't have to worry about, if you don't like how what Facebook is doing with your data, you could use a different client. Or you could set up a client that is specifically for whatever, people in Indonesia or people in China. And it could have like different kinds of use cases based on that like baseline data that exists. And it's a really interesting protocol. It's growing quite a bit. It's, as you see, their daily active users are growing. That said, it's still tiny. I think it's like 50,000 daily active users. Friendtech takes quite a different approach. And basically, they're monetizing people. They're monetizing personality. When you join Friendtech, your keys, they call them, because basically they used to call them shares, but I think they were a little nervous about the SEC's interpretation of such a thing. Your keys from your like Twitter profile or they're going to be launching stuff on like Instagram and everything else, they become tradable. And when your keys are traded, you get 5% of the fee that's generated, and and Friendtech gets 5% of the fee. I'll come back to you in one sec. And therefore you have this like people are trading keys in other people. I thought it was kind of ridiculous. It's kind of weird. And then I remembered when I was young, it was like a really cool thing to identify a band or like an artist very early and be like, well, I was there first. I heard it first. I used to like get these indie kind of recordings and like I had the cool stuff. And then you hear it on the radio at one point and you're like, man, I told everybody. And this is literally the way to bet on that. And this generation, they're like, oh, I know this influencer is going to blow up. So I'm going to buy his key. And then when everybody else wants his key, bang. Oh, by the way, sorry, the keys give you like kind of rights with uh, the key issuer, meaning like you have a special chat room with them, you can interact with them. Okay, sorry, I interrupted you.
So there is contingent on the popularity of the set influencer. And how is this different from, let's say, information? Sort of recognize the characteristic of some product, and that's what you sell as.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, and the question just for people online was, how does it relate to sort of traditional NFTs? I think there is a relationship, but the friend tech idea, which I do, by the way, I do think there will be a resurgence because they're planning like a relaunch. I do think that it does combine NFTs a bit, but it also really plays into sort of the attention economy, which is massive. Attention economy, gambling combined, I think it's probably something that's kind of interesting, sad and interesting, but not and related to like the NFT space where I think you can create communities and whatever. But the idea that monetizing like your presence and trading people's presence is both bizarre and interesting. Interestingly enough, and I promise that's the last time I'll say interesting. Do you know what two communities, so crypto community, so to friend tech, do you know what other community to friend tech? What other community that's kind of like online and influencers really wants to monetize their presence? Actually, OnlyFans. So you had this for a little while, actually right where you see that huge peak, you had this super bizarre crossover between the OnlyFans community and the crypto community, which is mostly like, technologist dudes who it was interesting to see. I'll just say. But I think it's I'm not saying that friend tech is gonna like take over for Facebook or whatever, just to be clear. Just that like these kinds of designs are quite new and interesting, and I think worth watching. Lens is the other one I mentioned. It's similar to Farcaster. It's not nearly as popular. I won't think too much about it. One of the things about social, though, that I think is important is the sort of blockchain values coming to social really is predicated upon people actually caring that their data is misused. And I'm not sure that people really do care at the end of the day. But yeah, let's move on. So the reason that all these things exist and that they're coming to light now is really because, as I mentioned before, a lot of crypto and a lot of the problem with crypto is that we're still building a Rails. We're building the infrastructure, and it's not easy to understand. And in order to understand like the applications, you do actually need to be able to talk about and understand a little bit about the infrastructure. And that's not easy for a lot of people, but there are some amazing new pieces of infrastructure coming to bear. So L2s, Ethereum L2s. Ethereum is sort of it's the biggest smart contract blockchain by volume. I think we all know this, and by TVL and by many metrics. But after their latest upgrade, if you will, their fork called Dencun, fees on L2s dropped by about 90%, meaning that what you can achieve now on both optimistic rollups and ZK rollups, which are coming, and there's really interesting stuff being done with ZK technology, and even ZK technology in the form of fraud proofs within L2s, which is coming. You now have this like sense of security, speed, and where you have a place to execute transactions quickly, cheaply, and with the same security that you would have in other on Ethereum mainnet, for instance. Next, you have, I guess, related to that, which is just more broadly a more modular feature. Eigenlayer, which just launched, I guess, what, 3 days ago onto mainnet, and basically it's like renting out Ethereum's security. It's very interesting. It's in and of itself probably like a half-hour topic, so I'm not going to go into it too much. And then Eigenlayer will be launching Eigen data availability, which is the same as Celestia, which is really just this data availability layer. It takes the key functions of an L1 blockchain, settlement, execution, consensus, data, and it pulls one of those layers out, data, and it says, you can just do this over here, which makes it much cheaper, more efficient, more scalable. Then if you take all that into account, you have all these L2s, you have all like, data blockchains, and you have one of the issues is that you're now really fractionalizing things and making it much more complicated. And so you have both account abstraction and chain abstraction combined with intents to basically set up some standards such that an average user doesn't need to know any of that. They can just go in and say, here's my intent. I would like to accomplish this thing. I want to buy ETH, or I want to earn this yield on this. And then you'll have a whole bunch of bots that will compete to go out and do that in the most efficient, least expensive way. And that will sort of take away all the complication from that modular sort of view of the world. And then on the right-hand side, you have improved structures in the monolithic structure. Monolithic structures means you're not necessarily looking at like L2s or taking layers out or any of those things. You just need bigger, better, faster way to process transactions in one place. And so Solana is the most famous, and Solana has a new client coming called Fire Dancer. It should make it much more robust, much more much faster, and it'll give it client diversity. So if one client has a problem, it won't be as problematic. But essentially, the way they do that is by parallelizing transactions. So they take transaction, they say, if the state of all of these transactions doesn't conflict with each other, then bang, it goes on. And it doesn't need, it only within those different sort of subsets, as long as there's no state that conflicts, these things can be posted to the chain. And so that monolithic infrastructure, they're making fantastic inroads with. And so same thing, you end up with faster, better, more secure systems. And that is leading towards really institutions are absolutely coming. They're at the door. So the Bitcoin ETFs in the United States were really an important point. Not only because, whatever JP Morgan thinks that $62 billion is going to flow into spot Bitcoin buying. I run a hedge fund. I'm pretty happy to see more spot buying. But what it really did was actually shift people's mindset. The culture is now different. It starts from groups like, BlackRock and family offices and the rest being able to say like, okay, this asset is real now. I have to reckon with it. What is it? What does it do? Why is it important? And before, it was just so easily dismissed that cultural change is huge. And you're starting to see it, especially in finance. So like I mentioned before, BlackRock's fund, which they tokenized a fund, it now has more than $280 billion. And I think it only launched maybe 3 weeks ago. And so BlackRock is building on-chain capabilities. And so you have this interesting time in blockchain where culturally now the established world understands that blockchain technology is interesting, and they're going to use those rails. You got Bitcoin, you've got HSBCs starting to do stuff, pushing out to retail, which is quite unique, gold funds. So you've got these like established interests that are saying, interesting, I'm going to build here. And on the other side, you have these crypto builders who have been around for ages. And the crypto people are saying, must be permissionless, must be no KYC, must be, it has these values built into it. And they're not going to see eye to eye. It's actually in how those meet in the middle that is going to be interesting. And I don't think it's going to be defined by, it's not going to be defined by who makes the most money or how things are done. It's going to be, and it's not going to be defined by regulators, because most of these industries are being taken globally before they had very jurisdictional regulations. I think that the key element and the way that we will find that path in between, and it's especially up to you guys, a lot of you are building in the space, is to actually question, like, what are the values behind what's being created? What are the values behind what we're using? And that's really important and an important part, and where I feel that, like, in the middle, if we do that properly, we'll find better systems for a lot of where crypto can have a real impact. Bang, done. You had a question, sir?
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you more about the exchange that's coming out, like crypto exchanges that have been banned, especially in Estonia. What's your opinion?
On decentralized exchanges?
Yeah.
I mean, decentralized exchanges are, they're pervasive. Uniswap, I think, being the biggest in the Ethereum ecosystem. This gentleman would probably know as much or more about myself, as he's doing some like high frequency trading stuff on decentralized exchanges. I think they're actually one of the only primitives in decentralized finance that is truly not just a cut paste from TradFi. And as such, because of the automated market maker and then the derivations thereon, they're really part of the underlying ecosystem of decentralized finance, and I mean, just like one of the most interesting kind of innovations. When you look at Uniswap, who just continues to innovate. So before, they were the pairing was just basically along a bonding curve, and then their V3 model basically took that and abbreviated the bonding curve such that you could set parameters. Thereby, you make your capital much more efficient on those bonding curves. And their V4 stuff will be even more interesting, because it'll be looking at that intent structure I was talking about before. Will you start to like abstract away some of the complexity of what's going on there? But like AMM's DEXs are amazing. Solana is kind of interesting because it offers the capability, and especially with FireDancer coming, to do this stuff tremendously inexpensively. And so that opens the design space even further. Part of the reason that like Uniswap and the AMM model exists is because you can't market make when you have to pay gas. The gas just takes that market making opportunity, and it makes the gap is too wide. So Solana actually you'll see a lot of innovation there, I think.
The kind of that's happening wherein they are almost limiting at exchanges and bearing the regulatory people investing, especially PMs, is something that is a clear concern. How do you think? What do you think?
Yeah, the regulatory matters around exchanges actually just yesterday, really moved to the forefront. So for those who aren't aware, the SEC served a Wells notice to Uniswap, and that's going to basically put decentralized finance, I was going to say put it on trial, but I think it's that, to the point of like, how do you, as to whether these things are securities or not, I think that, look, I don't really want to like get pulled into like what regulators should be thinking or doing. I have my own views. They're probably like sometimes scattered with profanity, which I'm given to understand is probably the wrong audience for. But I think like that Uniswap case, as it plays out over the next 18 to 24 months or whatever, is going to really set the tone. But Also, the tone it sets is important for the United States and not really that much elsewhere. Don't forget that like a lot of stuff that we're talking about is just not blanket, not available in the United States. Most airdrops now, not if you're in the US, no, can't do it, can't participate. So I'm not sure it matters because, like I said before, finance, along with a lot of other industries, are very localized, right? Like you need a license from your local regulator in order to run a bank. This is very specifically global. So the regulatory arbitrage opportunity is massive. So when jurisdictions decide, no, you cannot do this because it doesn't suit my own like sort of local interpretation, ultimately that's fine. You're going to lose the innovators. They'll move elsewhere. They're not going to stop doing it. They'll just say, okay, if you live there, you can't participate. Sir.
The whole institutional sort of, transition, and just wondered if, because they don't want to lose out, right? They're going in there to use the technology as they deem fit, but not, as we mentioned, go with the values of blockchain, original blockchain, Bitcoin. So how do you see that transition, and what are the dangers? Because they can just establish different privacy levels, and that's it. If you private blockchains.
Yeah, great. So the question was both sorry, just for the people who are listening, like as the institutions come, what are the dangers and what would that look like, right?
Well, all the values of Bitcoin, transparency and accessibility could be lost if they establish blockchain technology privacy levels with that. So the same thing they're doing. What they launched, the token they launched, they have a limit on how much, you got to invest millions if you want to buy it. Those are the, keys that they're keeping the keys.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the $1 million question, if you will, because the funny thing is, you take JP Morgan, for instance, and Jamie Dimon routinely says how trash he thinks crypto is and that it's all garbage. And that at one point he said something to the effect of, if you're found to be sort of trading crypto and you work for JP Morgan, you can get fired. And yet, JP Morgan has its own blockchain. It's called Onyx. It is a permissioned blockchain. And basically what they're trying to do is take traditional financial rails and put them on blockchain because, of course, it's much more efficient, right? But permissions, it's all within. In all fairness, I think it's probably better than the like Goldman Sachs-y version called digital assets, which is actually used its own language, and Onyx is more or less like using ERC20s, using Ethereum. I think it's going to look like that, meaning I think that until such time as the banks can use it to, one, replace their rails on the back end to make themselves much more efficient, and two, to build things that they can own. That's how they're coming at it. And the crypto builders, though, are exactly value misaligned with that. It's not about ownership. It's about disintermediation. Well, you go and talk to Jamie Dimon about disintermediation. He's not going to be too keen on that. So there's definitely going to be this huge battle for ideals. I don't have the magic answer as to how that works out, but I do think that you will end up with two systems. I think that there will be a system that is mostly guarded by on and off ramps that basically affords you the ability to go and interact with Aave. And Aave's not going to really care who you are.
And the corporation that's not too far away, AGI, within the system because they need so much data. I mean, that's a good positive take on it, that the need for data availability will make everything more transparent.
Yeah, so the question was like, what's the relation to AGI and so I think like data is maybe not necessarily the right, because the AGIs need so much data that it's maybe not super compatible. I think some of the ideas around like the combination of crypto and AI would be like incentivizing agents using like something of value, like crypto. I think that there's some interesting stuff around some of the GPU, like renting GPUs essentially in like a crypto kind of decentralized way. There are some protocols that are starting to use crypto primitives to be able to like use and test models. I think that probably isn't it leaves a lot to be desired at the moment. But regardless of no tau bit tensor, but I like there's going to be a lot of forcing together of these two concepts. That means two things to me. One, there might be some interesting stuff that's built there, and two, people will be gambling on it. The trick is to like figure out what's actually interesting and actually meaningful. And at the moment, to be honest, that's not super easy. Actually, John, who's there, has done more research. He's also with Golden Pear, and he's done quite a bit of research on it. And that's why I'm speaking not so knowledgeably about it. If you actually want to talk to someone who knows what they're talking about, he's the man. Chang.
Areas, but in other countries, it's very a lot of this there are workers with innovation, and it's difficult to offer the United States that are being do it somewhere else. So do you feel that that's opportunity for countries like Canada, since we are based in Canada, obviously the leading institution. So what are the implications for Canada?
I have to be a little careful, like what I say, with regards to our neighbors south of the border and how they regulate things. But regardless, if you're a builder in the United States at the moment, you're terrified. Even if you're building something like helium, which is not, it's not a financial primitive, but I'm guaranteed they have tons of lawyers who are looking at like, hey, we're tokenizing this. This is security. This is not a security. What would happen? How does it work? And the net effect of that is that, as I said before, because these are like global primitives, is that these developers just look to be somewhere else and they build into other markets. So there's a huge opportunity for countries like Canada to lay out regulation that actually does protect people. So I actually think Canada's kind of done a decent first job. First of all, they allowed ETFs years ago, number one. Number two, they said in a policy which at first brush looks kind of crazy, as I recall, it's like, unless it's Ethereum, Bitcoin, and a few other like kind of majors, and I don't want to name them because they're generally not great tokens, but you can buy as much of those as you want. But if you're on a Canadian exchange and you want to buy anything else, you have a cap. You can only spend 30,000 Canadian a year. They'll only sell you 30,000 a year of like whatever, bit tensor or whatever. And the net effect is, for someone who knows what they're doing in crypto, you're like, well, that's ridiculous, because I could just take my ETH and go in to decentralized finance and I could buy whatever I want. I could buy as much of whatever I want It makes no sense. But actually, it's kind of a cool gate because you're like, maybe it's a tip of the hat to say, like, if you know what you're doing, have at it. If you don't know what you're doing, don't. You shouldn't be. You're capped. You're done. Or go buy an ETF. There's a few of them over here. Have at it. It's like it seems like almost for that point in time, recently, I think like decently sensible. With that said, the amount of like legislation that's going to be required in order to put controls around stablecoins. So in the US, I think this week you'll see some stablecoin legislation, but stablecoins needs its own legislation, decentralized finance, more clarity around the treatment of what these things actually are. Are they commodities? Are they securities? How do we and disclosures? Like a lot of you can go and issue a token right now. And what kind of disclosures do I have to make? Nothing. I don't have to say anything. But maybe there should be a forced disclosure regimes. Like there are things that should be done, and these things will be coming. The United States has shown that there's a huge battle. They are not going to be leaders in regulation. And so it is a big opportunity for other countries to jump ahead, I think. Can I one more thing before I'm done? Just if I may, we are looking for interns at the moment. I know there's lots of like great bright minds in the audience, both here and online. If you have any interest, then by all means do talk to myself or Marilyn, John. We'd love to have a chat with you.
You have program meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not interns are yeah. We're looking for like smart people.
On that note, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, very insightful. And let's do peace and coffee and questions. Please do ask Allan or we will post the recording of the session to our YouTube meeting. So please follow us. We will have all the updates. And once again, thank you. And have a great day, everyone.